Which punishment, either real or imagined, sounds light or not a big deal at first, but is actually horrific to experience? I was too scared to ask to go to the bathroom in front of the entire class, so I'd hold it. I had some accidents as a kid in the earliest grades because I just couldn't hold it any longer. One year, I had a class where we'd work on our own for much of the time. During that time, I could go up to the teacher directly and discreetly ask to whiz. That class was an absolute lifesaver. It was the only chance I'd have to whiz all day. Every single day, I'd ask to go whiz during that class. I could tell the teacher was very suspicious and 100% thought I was just asking to go because I wanted out of class. But to her credit, she let me go anyway. I really did have to whiz, badly, every time. So glad she let me go despite her suspicion. I bet that teacher went home and started timing her own bathroom breaks, just to see if it was physically possible. Story 2. Outlawry. To be declared an outlaw. Today we think of an outlaw as just anybody who breaks the law regularly. Back in the day, though, it was a punishment. If you were declared outlaw, that meant you were literally outside of the law and could claim no protection from it. If someone didn't like you, they could freely hurt you, rob you, or even end you. When the stories refer to Robin Hood as an outlaw, that's what they're talking about. It's not a romantic, heroic, swashbuckling thing. It's the state of having no claim to any legal protection at all. The king, or whoever he appoints, takes your land, anybody who wants it can take your stuff, and anybody who doesn't like you can just harm you without consequences. They can also put a bounty on your head and have people hunting you to claim it. What do you think would happen if you lost all protection from the law and anybody who brought your head to the courthouse could claim a year's salary as a reward? Story 3. Tickling. No joke, people use this as a form of torment in some cases. It doesn't leave a mark, so it's also used in environments like mental facilities where patients may be restrained and staff go on a power trip. Extreme cases can result in incontinence, retching, and a loss of consciousness due to the inability to breathe. It's also easier for the tormentor to do it for a long time without it wearing away at their conscience because the victim is involuntarily laughing, so it's easy to pretend that it's not that bad. Story 4. This is actually a famous punishment parents would use to punish their child here in my country, but years have passed. It was never practiced by some as they just realized that it is mean to do such things, and some still use it in secret, unfortunately. My grandmother used to tell me a story back when she was in high school about one of his boyfriend getting tormented by letting him kneel and sea salt by his parents when her friend said to his parents that he's gay. It happened, I think, in early 1950s, where gay is really not being talked about and it's treated as a grave sin as it contradicts the religious faith they uphold. My grandmother said he would go to school with scarred knee marks and one day found in the street crying hard that he feels like fainting because of the pain in his knees, to the point where her friend can't walk anymore. Her friend told her to keep it a secret, but the way his knee looks was too horrible, she had to report it, so a day before she was about to report it, her friend was in the hands of authorities and his father was captured after neighbors reported it. Grandma said that the neighbors are concerned for her friend after her friend has been screaming and crying for 4 days straight. One time, 3 neighbors felt like something was wrong and kept an eye on their house and saw our friend kneeling with salt for a whole day. They reported it to the officials immediately. That was the last time Grandma heard about her boyfriend, and right now, he might be gone, but she hopes everything was well for him. Story 5. Painting rocks. A couple of guys in my AIT unit got in trouble. The sadistic drill sergeant tried being creative with an improved punishment, which was painting rocks. As dumb as a punishment it is, the sadistic side was that this training unit was in southern Arizona during peak summer temperatures. The rocks were literally hot enough to fry an egg on, and both privates' hands ended up being covered with second-degree burns. The drill sergeant faced pretty heavy administrative action. I don't recall exactly what, but it's probably one of the most severe I had ever heard a drill sergeant receive. Story 6. Waterboarding. If any of you kids don't know, this was a big debate back in the early 2000s. Some people were calling it torment, others were more or less like, it's literally just pouring water on someone's face. What's the big deal? Now, when you put it like that, yeah, what's the big deal? Take someone, make them lay down and hold them down so they can't move, pour water on their face. What's the big deal? I remember one conservative radio host got the bright idea to prove live on the air that it's not as bad as they are saying, by having his staff waterboard him on air. And you know what? I respect this guy for doing this. He had a strongly held belief that he was willing to go through it to try and prove his point. He lasted all of 15 seconds before he tapped out of it, hacked and coughed for about 5 seconds, and finally managed to say, definitely torment, before suggesting they go to a break so he can recover from that. Good on him for admitting he was wrong. Story 7. Closing your hand around a chunk of saltwater ice and holding it there. Dubbed the Salt and Ice Challenge, where people hold onto it for as long as they can stand. It can lead to frostbite injuries similar to second and third degree burns. I did this about 20 years ago, before it was a thing on social media. It sucks. Story 8. Since you said imaginary, there was a punishment shown in Star Trek Deep Space Nine that Black Mirror copied a couple times, and science fiction is used as a concept, likely before DS9. The concept is time dilation, the idea that time takes place at a different rate in the real world than it does in some other. Before the punishment, the character Miles O'Brien was strapped in a chair for an hour and sedated, and he dreamed he served a 10-year prison sentence. Or maybe it was longer, but in his mind, he was trapped in the cell for years and years. In the dream, he may have been deprived of food, he was definitely deprived of social interaction, but at the end of it, he woke up and only an hour had passed. Story 9. Standing at parade rest without being able to talk for 5 hours. In basic training, someone got caught stealing food from the DFAC no more than 20 minutes after he'd been yelled at for people doing that. As a punishment, we stood at parade rest from 5 p.m. to 10 p.m. without being able to talk and with at least one DS watching us at all times. I don't know how to describe it, but your brain can only come up with so much to do for 5 hours while not moving. Story 10. Kneeling in salt. When I was 16, my mother told me if I kept my attitude up, I'd be kneeling in salt. Being a dumb kid, I was like, whatever, it's just salt. Well, I kept that attitude up. My mom sprinkled a light dusting of salt on the tile floor in the kitchen, and I had to kneel in salt for half an hour. The grains cut my knees and burned the wounds. I'm 32 now, and I still have scars on my knees. I'll add this before I hit reply. I know this was cruelty. My mom was pregnant at the time and not in a good place mentally. My sister is now 16 and has never even had as much as a slap. Just recently, my sister told me she thinks I was just a bad kid if mom did all that to me. I told my mother about the conversation after, and my mother said, "You weren't a bad kid. None of you were. I just had a temper and I didn't know how to control it. I'll admit I'm an adult now with 2 kids of my own, and hearing her say that made me cry on the way home. I knew in my head I wasn't a bad child. I rarely got in trouble, never did substance. I just had an attitude. But I hadn't realized how heavy my heart was. I was the first of 3 kids. I got the worst of it, and I always blamed myself. Even when I was finally over it and rebuilt a relationship with my mom, I blamed myself. I hadn't realized how much I needed to hear her say that until she did. This was 3 weeks ago, and I'm tearing up just typing this. Story 11. My cousin, 10-year-old, quite agile, never sits still. Once he troubled my aunt so much that she punished him. His punishment was to sit still in the bed and do nothing. No TV, no playing either on phone or with his toys, not even speaking. No one was allowed to come into his room so that he couldn't even watch others. He asked her to read his textbook as he thought studying would lessen her anger, but she denied even studying. He had to sit completely still. Initially, that punishment seemed quite simple to me, but what impact it had on a small child was huge. This punishment torments you by boring you, which a small child can't take. At last, he broke down crying, after which he was pardoned. He probably started calculating the exact number of seconds in his punishment, then recalculating it in milliseconds, then converting into the lifespan of a housefly just to have something to do. Story 12. Bread and water. A naval punishment that also includes being put in the brig and served to remove some of the only variety a person would find in a ship. Longer periods of the punishment led to vitamin deficiencies and unhealthy weight loss. Originally, it was allowed for up to 30 days, and over the last century and score to 3 days max. Finally abolished by the USN a few years ago. Brits ended it in the 1890s. Keel hauling, where you tie a rope around the ship and use said rope to pull an individual across the bottom of the ship. This usually resulted in the person getting all sorts of cuts and blunt trauma, the very real possibility of passing away. It was not unheard of for victims to be left tied to the mast or yard arm as an example to the rest of the ship's company. To leave you in a less serious punishment, I give you the salute line. If an officer is making a joke of himself, the commanding officer would have the ship's company line up and each render the said officer a salute. Officers must return each salute, and failure to return a salute would be considered conduct unbecoming. Not sure if this was ever actually done or just something read in a book or was told by my dad, who was retired USN. Story 13. Peeling salted sunflower seeds with your bare hands. I had the choice between that and getting my back with a cable when I screwed up big time when I was like 6 years old. Chose the peeling, and I regretted that immensely. It doesn't sound bad at first, but let me tell you, after 1 hour, you just want to hold your hands in ice water. Your fingertips get sore. Sometimes you prick your skin and the salt dries out your fingers and makes them really sensitive. Not to mention that the salt creeps up in your nail bed and hurts like crap. I never chose that punishment again. Story 14. Famine walls. This was something I had never heard of until I took a trip to Ireland and saw them firsthand. These were famine walls, and they were built during the famine of the 1840s as a means to keep the hungry masses out of the estates of the landowners. We learned it was the usually homeless Catholics who built the walls, for a few scraps to eat. According to our guide, massive, largely pointless work projects like the famine walls and the famine roads kept the masses barely alive during the 4 years that the potato crop failed. British rule had proclaimed that the poor had to work for sustenance and not be given charity. Just think about how demoralizing this would be. Day after day, building stone walls with zero purpose just to earn your bread and soup for the day. The shocking thing is the scope of the famine walls. They're literally everywhere in the countryside as far as you can see. Story 15. My dad told me about a punishment that was given in schools when he was growing up. Born in 1954. Which was, you had to go to the side of the aisle of desks and squat down, into like the Asian or Russian squat stance, and hold it for the rest of class. He said it never sounded bad, but after a while your muscles and knees would lock up, and at the end of the class, in order to get out of that position, you had to fall into your side or back to the floor to let your legs relax enough to allow you to move and use them. He told me when I was super young, but it always stuck with me because I was so surprised that something that seemingly small would cause so much pain and loss of control. You essentially got insane Charlie horses when you dropped out of that position. Story 16. Being found not guilty by reason of insanity. No matter the length of sentence you're given, it is up to the doctors to determine when you can be released. A sentence of 10 years in a psychiatric facility could mean 20, 30, or life. The doctors will only release you when they determine it's safe for you to re-enter society and you're no longer a threat. What doctor is going to release someone and take the chance you'll re-offend? Almost none. You'll also be given medications that have terrible side effects. You'll put on a bunch of weight, feel sleepy all the time, dizzy, and eventually develop repetitive movements. You'll be in the general population with other people suffering from severe mental illness, which can drive you crazy in itself. The upside is it may be slightly cleaner than regular prison. You have a little more space to move around, the entire unit, even though it's going to be small, and eventually you can earn day passes. Compared to regular prison, it may be a little better overall, but it is still a horrible way to spend your life. It's also incredibly difficult to have this defense apply to your case. So if someone does a crime and thinks they can just plead insanity and be out in 10 years, they are most likely not going to be found insane. Story 17. In my home country, the penalty for mistreatment and substance trafficking is whipping. With no limit, specific number to be set by the judge. First, they clinically clear you for the punishment. Then they get you in a bent-over pose while your back is visible through a wooden frame. The tormentor, a man in a legit hood, shows up and dips a horsewhip in medicine. The medicine serves two purposes. Firstly, it helps with slight healing during the whipping in order to allow the prisoner more lashes during that sitting. And secondly, because the medicine is sticky. There's a very old video of it being carried out on YouTube. Story 18. Any punishment where if it doesn't physically harm the person, you make them do it for a long time. I was punished at a very young age, somewhere between 7 to 10, for not being manly, so my stepfather, schmuck of all time, decided to toughen me up. He sat me down on the sofa and told me, under no circumstances, was I allowed to leave the sofa. If I needed the toilet, I was to tell him and he would let me go to the bathroom. But if I took longer than a few minutes, he would come in to make sure I wasn't hiding. Now that doesn't sound so bad sitting on the sofa. That wasn't my punishment. My punishment to toughen me up was I was to sit on the sofa, not moving, and not allowed to look away. And he put on horror movie after horror movie after horror movie all day. From morning to my bedtime, and these were 80s horror movies. Prince of Darkness, Poltergeist, Hellraiser, Night of the Demons, the OG Evil Dead, not the sequels, the Living Dead films. I love horror now that I'm an adult, but for a little kid me, I literally couldn't sleep properly or speak for a week. And I'm pretty sure I'm mentally messed up in some ways. But that was just an example of how much of an utter, and I'm sorry Americans, schmuck this guy was. Story 19. Something I actually did to myself. I needed to cut weight for a wrestling tournament in a drastic way. Because of a mix-up in weight classes, I needed to drop 16 pounds overnight. Told my coaches that's not possible. Just pull me from the roster, but my head coach pulls me aside and tells me there might be a way and you don't even have to work out. What you do is fill a bathtub up with the hottest water you can stand and add a bag of Epsom salt and some rubbing alcohol to the water. Go into the bathroom with a buddy, stuff towels under the doors so cool air can't get in, and then get in the tub neck deep. After 60 seconds, your body will already be screaming to get out of the water because you're overheating. I stayed in for 45 minutes, adding more hot water every 2 to 3 minutes to ensure the hell never ended. The buddy is there to make sure you don't pass away. Sweat out 11 pounds in 45 minutes. Story 20. There were bamboo cages built for POWs that were submerged in water. The water level was high enough that you couldn't sit down and the cage was short enough where you couldn't stand up. They were also small enough so you couldn't allow your own buoyancy to help you float, but your body fat percentage after being starved for a few weeks probably wouldn't allow that to happen anyway. So you basically took a semi-crouched position, spending every waking second figuring out how you could maybe get a few minutes of sleep without drowning while your body was slowly getting infested. Good times. Story 21. My parents did this when I brought home bad grades. They'd explode at first and yell a lot, then pretend it didn't exist for the next few days. They'd still feed me and drive me where I needed to go, but just the bare minimum for communication. I would always dread hearing the garage door open when my mom came home because I knew I would be greeted by her silence. My dad got over things quicker because he was the one who always had to drive me everywhere. I'm in college now and never open up about school. Doesn't matter if I bomb a test or ace it. If I slept in and missed a lab, if I had a really stressful presentation, I just always say good when my parents ask. No way in hell I'm giving them my student login info either. I have a somewhat cold relationship with them right now. Sometimes I wonder why, like all the reasons why. I try to mend it because I was a huge schmuck to them as well, and sometimes I still lose my temper at them. I find myself thinking how much of this is their fault, how much is mine. I wonder all the time which things I'm on the right side and which ones I'm in the wrong. They're also first-generation immigrants. English isn't their native language, whereas I was born and raised in the US, so there's a language gap, and that really muddies things as well. I end up wondering how much that contributed to our distancing. Story 22. Having your children forced into a residential school. As a white person, at first you could see this title and think, oh, it was a school, well, at least they could get some form of education. Then you learn more about the 190 or so schools across Canada and come to realize that they were far from actual schools and much more like concentration camps. There was very little learning and much more unlearning of Native kids' own languages, culture, and practices. The sole purpose of these schools was to, quote, end the Indian in the child. Kids were pestered, hurt, starved, and terminated. This has gone on for at least 150 years and recently ended in 1996. Recently, a mass grave was discovered at one residential school in British Columbia. The only punishable thing these kids ever did in the eyes of colonial settlers was being born native. So yeah, screw Canada. Not feeling very proud of being Canadian. Story 23. Not to get all incredibly PC on everyone, and I already know I'm probably going to get downvoted to hell and back, but spanking. If you take your feelings out of it and think about it from a logistic point of view, it's an incredibly barbaric action. You take a defenseless child who can't fight back, put yourself in a position of power above them, and then strike them with the intention of hurting them all in an effort to get them to be afraid of not conforming to your ideals. And then society has been convinced that it's okay if it's only your child you're hurting, and only if you hurt them in a very specific part. I've been alive for 30-ish years and a parent for 7, and I still can't wrap my brain around how any of this makes sense. Civilized people don't go around hurting other people when they don't listen to us or they make a mistake, so why do we do it to our children? If you're enjoying the video, don't forget to hit that subscribe and like button for more videos like this. Story 24. Putting autistic kids in seclusion rooms during tantrums. If we're having a meltdown or violent, we do need to be removed from the class, but an isolation room doesn't help us calm down. The flicker of the overhead light is harder to ignore than panic attacks, and there is nothing in the room that could help us focus on other things. Some schools don't even have a light in there, or put a kid in the closet. I was very rude and disobedient in middle school, so I got put in the seclusion room a lot. They'd continue to hold me after school was supposed to end, and since I never apologized or gave in, they'd hold me until the entire school had to close for the day and my dad would pick me up. This is actually a violation of human rights. Putting children in solitary confinement, but who's going to listen to a screaming autistic kid? Story 25. My choice would be denying possessions and privileges. You use that in prison to control the most difficult inmates. Pain, solitary, things you might expect would work only escalate their misbehavior. There's research that sociopaths don't respond to emotional or physical efforts to control them, but taking their freedom and possessions does. So we'd stop their phone, mail, visits, commissary, and recreation, and they become model inmates. Sitting in an empty room with literally nothing is the worst. There was an inmate, Thomas Silverstein, who ended an officer, Gene Klutz, at Marion Penitentiary in 1983. He also ended 2 other inmates prior to those, who were gang members opposed to the gang he belonged to. He was Aryan Brotherhood, and they were DC Blacks. After he ended Officer Klutz, he was placed in an empty cell in Atlanta Pen for a time till the Cuban riots in Atlanta was burned down. Then in the basement of the federal prison in Leavenworth with nothing in it till 2005 when he was moved to the new administrative maximum prison in Florence, Colorado. He passed away there in 2019. So from 1983 till 2019, it was kept in no human contact status. According to federal law, the only thing inmates are required is food, medical care, clothing, and a place to exercise. Everything else is a privilege. Because the room was 8 by 8, it qualified as an exercise space. It was placed there and never left till he passed away. He complained about it any chance he got, calling it the worst torment a person could endure. Peter Early, in his book The Hot House, asked about this punishment. The official answer is, "We can't execute Silverstein, so we have no choice but to make his life a living hell. Otherwise, other inmates will end guards too. There has to be some supreme punishment. Every convict knows what Silverstein is going through. We want them to realize that if they cross the same line that he did, they will pay a heavy price." Story 26. The white torment is the only torment I know that is 100% psychological and nothing else. You're placed in a room, constantly lit by bland white lights. The room itself is fully white as well. The only food you get is white-colored food with barely any taste, and you are served water in a white or transparent plastic glass as your only drink. And it's in complete silence because the room is soundproof and you're not allowed to make a sound. To put it simply, your brain receives no stimulus whatsoever. You go insane with barely any chance of recovering. Story 27. My parents never let me see friends for whatever reason. I didn't clean my room, my grades weren't good enough, whatever. I was always shifting, so I was never good enough. Come to find out in my adulthood, I have ADHD and executive dysfunction as a witch, and explained why I could never do what was expected of me. But never being allowed to see friends really messed me up. Eventually, you just stop trying to make friends because you can't participate in any activities with them. So you're just the weird kid all by your lonesome, or you only talk to people in class and never form a deeper friendship beyond classmates. And eventually, you stop trying to meet the impossible standards. So you just give up. Coming into college, I really struggled, and it was to the point where I would push people away who tried to get close to me. So I had this great environment in college where people would constantly try to be my friend, and I was away from my parents so I could theoretically do whatever I wanted. But I just physically, psychologically couldn't. I eventually dropped out because of the difficulty in interacting with peers, and because of medical issues, diagnosed bipolar and endometriosis. I isolated myself for years. Moved back in with my parents, never left my room except to go to class. I was taking classes at the local community college. It just made it all so much worse. Eventually I said enough. I'm going back to college, and I did. But it was even worse this time because I had zero social skills. From being psychologically trapped in my room, never talking to anyone, I had roommates this time, so that was the beginning of me getting out of it. Then they suggested I download Tinder, and I met my husband, and things have gone so much better ever since then. Now I have social skills and coworkers who I can talk to, and I feel myself finally pulling out of it. This has been a 6-year journey of recovery since I met my husband, and he's done such a good job of pulling me out of it. But I still isolate myself when I get stressed and I have no close friends. Crap affects you for life. Story 28. Mine isn't so exotic. It just boils down to basic harming. My father was an animal who used to get so frustrated with life, and with being stuck with me after my mother left, that he used to lose it completely at times and subject me to the most horrific harmings. He'd hit me with his hand so hard that it would pain him, so he'd start kicking me while I'd bunch myself up into a little ball on the ground and put my hands and arms over me to protect my head. That used to drive him crazy, and he'd scream at me to lower my hands so he could hit his favorite target, be so terrified that I'd lower them so he could hit me around the head. How screwed is that? When his own hands would hurt too much, he'd often pick up any object nearby to continue the harming. Shoes were the favorite object, though he once picked up a chair to go at me. So yeah, when people want to talk about punishments, that may not seem that big a deal compared to classic techniques. Don't write off basic harming. It can leave people traumatized and damaged for life. Story 29. If someone was convinced of a crime and you gave them the choice of spending several years locked up in a building with other violent criminals, the range of activities they're allowed to participate in is dramatically curtailed. Privacy is non-existent. They will rarely be permitted to interact with their family or friends. The guards will routinely pester them as a matter of course. Punishments for minor infractions include solitary confinement. Their time in this facility will permanently affect their future employment opportunities, etc. Or getting lashed 25 times, after which they'll receive medical treatment and can then resume their lives without incident. I imagine virtually everyone would choose the second one, except maybe some small number of people who are unusually sensitive to physical pain or who have difficulty functioning in society anyway. I think this would probably be true even if we were talking about Scandinavian prisons, which treat the inmates exceptionally well. We've collectively decided that the second option is cruel and inhumane, so now the only option left is an option which, by any reasonable standard, is far crueler and less humane than the one we took off the table. Story 30. Being arrested and booked for DUI. And you were sleeping it off in a parking lot, in a car, without the keys in the ignition. Citizens' arrests in California Highway Patrol don't play. Plus the $15,000 you'll pay in fines, lawyer, treatment, and weekend jail for a year. Punishment is determined to law by BAC. Mine was 2.3. It gets better. When I got to work the following Monday, I received anonymous emails threatening me to resign from my job due to the DUI. Explaining this instance to my employer at the time and since then humbled me to the ground. Happy to say it was almost 7 years ago, and not a day goes by that I do not have some sort of vasovagal memory of a hangover and being in the tank. With a master's degree. Saturday night, Valentine's Day, alone in a place with no friends or family. Don't let your fear-mongering boomer parents push you into manifest destiny by yourself just to make something out of you. If I could save a nervous breakdown or two, then sharing this was worth it. Story 31. My parents were creative. I lied once, so the punishment was to go for a jog around the neighborhood after they'd kicked me around for a bit. To make sure I kept pace, they followed me with a family car and laid on the horn if I slowed down. I lived in a small town, so everyone knew me and my family. So when I started slowing down, they'd lay on the horn and let the town know I was a liar who couldn't take a harming and needed to run. When the jog was done, I did wall sits or push-ups in a rotation while my kid brother was roped into helping transport every belonging he had into the trash bags and hidden. By the end of the evening, I had a mattress, a military alarm clock to wake me up at sunrise, and a Bible. I was 13 and never forgot that day. The public shaming speedrun technique. Innovative, if a little loud. Story 32. Forced internalization of negative self-worth. My mother wouldn't just verbally and physically harm me. She wouldn't stop until she'd completely crushed me, until I felt like the worst human being ever born. My earliest memory of this, I was 7. I'm past 50 and I'm still working through it. For others who have experienced this, focus on internalization. That seems to be the key issue in determining who shrugs off insults or negative messages and who is wounded by them. If, like me, you were basically trained to internalize because the screaming and hitting wouldn't stop until you did, it takes active work to resist it, but you can do it. Story 33. I've always thought the whipping boy sounds awful. People see it as someone else took the punishment for you. It's no big deal. This is some affluenza crap. From the moment you're born, they pick another kid your age, and then you two are raised basically like siblings. You're special, so no one can lay a hand on you, but your friend is just a peasant. If you screw up, they can harm him. That blowing off your classes to go swimming, that I can steal one of the cook's pies, that I'm 9, I'll be defiant because I'm tired and crabby. All comes home when you get to listen to your brother scream in pain and then sob violently for hours afterward. To see his terror every time you contemplate a little bit of childhood mischief. To watch him pay for every one of your mistakes. Just always seemed really brutal and powerful to me. It's not, you're a prince or heir, etc., so you don't get any punishment. It's, you messed up and the people you love and care about are going to suffer and pay for it. You're a noble or royal, so this is how you're going to pay for it. Story 34. For lots of people, unfortunately, prison seems light. It's absolutely not light. Yes, there are in some cases very open prisons for misdemeanors and small crimes. But being restricted from your liberty for years or even your life is far worse than people tend to think. Depending on your country, you may spend your life in a literal hellhole and suffer psychologically. In Western countries, even if the prison is new and has activities and all, you are still locked down and forbidden to go anywhere or hope to see anything more than the wall you see every day. Look at the reaction of people during lockdowns in their own home. Imagine now being in an industrial-looking place, locked down for years or even forever. Passing away is instantaneous. No punishment here. Lockdown is long and lets you rot in your own mind in tiny hell. Story 35. The water room. You're basically stuffed into a cage too small to comfortably stand. You're then lowered into water up to your neck and left there. That's it. You can't stand up straight because there's no room. You can't sit because you'll drown. You have to take a mess where you stand. Into the water that could be occupied by several cages with other people inside. You'd have to drink that water, eventually causing retching, further polluting the water. Some water rooms were in buildings where it would typically be constantly dark and cold. Some were in outdoor pits, so the water would get cold at night and bugs would be attracted to your exposed head, driving you crazy. You can't even swat them away because usually your hands are supporting your weight to keep your head above water. Sometimes spikes would be installed in the sides of the cage to prevent you from supporting yourself too easily. After a while in water, you'd end up with horrific wounds and that would immediately become infected by the polluted water. Sometimes other things are thrown into the water, like rats, snakes, or other small animals. They'd pass away in the water pit, further contributing to the gross water. People can last months like that before they pass away from massive infection. Story 36. Supervised visits with your kids. Many courts have a very low bar for introducing this, easily presuming that fathers in particular have little to offer and are likely threats to their children. All that is really needed is a mother willing to say whatever they need to, a good lawyer, and an apathetic court. Regardless of the effects on the sanctioned parent, it does affect the kids in deep and irreparable ways. The only thing it benefits is the accusing parent's ego. For me and my boys, it's been 7 years without anything resembling what most people think due process looks like in America. And yes, I am completely innocent and am a wonderful father. And no, I don't care if you don't believe me. Story 37. Maybe not as bad as some of the ones listed here, but the screw that used to be used in prisons in the UK. The idea was that if you have a box which has a crank attached, the crank does nothing except in some cases it makes a ticker progress with a number of turns. The prisoner would be forced to turn the crank for extended periods, 4 to 10 hours usually, without stopping. The guards could also tie in the screw mechanism to make it harder to do. I did a tour of the Crumlin Road jail in Belfast, and they had a version that was a wheel filled with sand that was basically the same thing. Sounds fine, just like one of those exercise machines in the gym, except it's not. If you stop, you get harmed. You aren't given lots of water to stay hydrated, so you sweat and become dehydrated, which makes your muscles cramp and seize up. But you still can't stop. They make you keep doing it even if the pain is unbearable. The point was to physically and mentally break the prisoner to keep them in line. UK prisoners have only fairly recently been concerned with the idea of rehabilitation. They were, for most of our history, explicitly there to punish criminals in as many inventive ways as possible. It's also why prison guards in the UK are commonly called screws in slang. Story 38. This is a punishment I imagined for hell as a kid. You go to hell and your punishment is to continually wash dishes for eternity. However, you have the option to change your punishment one time. You don't get to choose the new punishment, and once you change, that's what you're stuck with for the rest of eternity. Either spend eternity washing dishes, haunted by the question of whether the new punishment is better or worse, or you risk spending eternity experiencing something worse and thinking, damn, washing dishes wasn't so bad, but you can never go back. Similarly, I also thought it would suck if you went to hell and they said, okay, you're here for eternity. You can whiz 1 billion times. At first, it's like, okay, that's a lot. But as eternity drags on, you will run out and you'll have a long time to watch that number decrease gradually. You start holding it longer and longer as the end approaches until eventually you use up the last one and know that you will never feel that relief again. Story 39. The worst and simultaneously best punishment I ever received, I brought on myself. My brother, 15, and I, 17, went to a party once. We didn't really plan to. We weren't really people who got invited to parties. We were hanging out with some friends of ours and they were going to the party, so they dragged us along. Anyway, drinks were had, music played, and a few fights broke out. Then somewhere around stupid o'clock, I see my dad marching through the crowded party. I have no time to react. Partially because I'm too intoxicated to process. Partially because there's a girl sitting in my lap and I didn't think to toss her to the ground and dive behind the couch. Anyways, my dad and I lock eyes and I can see the fury. We stare at each other uncomfortably for either an eternity or 5 seconds. I don't remember which. Then he storms into the next room. A few seconds later, I see him marching out of the house with my brother in tow. My party vibe is gone. I'm dreading what awaits me back home, but I stay until it winds down because I want to make sure my parents are asleep when I get home. Hit my bed somewhere around 5 a.m. At 8 a.m., there's a knock on my bedroom door. My dad pokes his head in and he says to me, "You have the lawn fully mowed to perfection by 9 a.m. or we talk about last night. The choice is yours." So there I was, hungover and possibly still intoxicated, clinging desperately to the mower the way an Irishman clings to a blade of grass, and trying desperately not to retch from the smell of gasoline and freshly cut grass. I'm certain I didn't finish by 9, but that lawn was immaculate before I went back inside. Story 40. When I was about 6, I'd done something to my mother that made her remove all furniture from my bedroom, excluding the mattress and bed frame, with the goal being to behave to earn it back. I now have serious issues with both abandonment, boundaries, and authority, considering I cried my eyes out daily and slept in a room with one blanket that wasn't mine or any of my things for about a month, and literally was never told what I did wrong. This was also impossible in our small house, but she was determined to make it everyone's problem, filling a hallway not big enough for 2 people to walk side by side. Apparently, she had seen this punishment used in a teenager in Dr. Phil or a similar show, and it worked. I was 6 years old, preschool aged. Most of my childhood was spent melting down or freaking out, but it wasn't difficult. It took until I was 16 to be diagnosed with autism. Not that my parents weren't seeking that diagnosis either. I was unfortunately born a girl in the late 1990s, which meant I couldn't have autism to any doctors I went to. I brought it up to my mom when I moved out. I'm 24 now, and she admitted the idea was from a daytime medical talk show and she doesn't remember what I did either. And I made sure to tell her it's the one thing I've told every therapist or professional I've seen since it happened. She apologized, but unfortunately, it's done. Story 41. When I was around 11, I told my mom that I hated her. I was at the age when all my female friends were weaponizing their words and, well, they said that their mothers cried when they said it. It was not my mom. She pulled out the dictionary and basically the definition of hate is disliking something or someone to the point you wish they didn't exist. As of that moment, she no longer existed except for the things that she had to supply by law. I am physically disabled, and at the time, my mom was my main caregiver. So I was provided with clean clothes, but I wasn't allowed to pick them out. I was provided with health care, but my mom only spoke to me when necessary. I was provided with a balanced diet, but while my family ate a hot home-cooked meal, I ate peanut butter and jelly, an apple, raw carrots, and a glass of milk. That lasted 2.5 days before I broke, apologized, and asked to be forgiven. I've never used the H word in front of my mom since, and I am 38. Well, if you like these stories, here's more. YouTube thinks you're going to love this. Catch you in that video.